was an abolitionist and martyr whose actions in Harper's Ferry helped to show Americans the importance of belief and action. John Brown broke the racial barriers by brutally fighting with all he had to end slavery, and inspired others to fight for what they believed in, and gave minorities the passion to become equal.
Way before John Brown was even born, the Third Congress had made an act that was to be put in place in 1807. This act prohibited slaver ships to transport slaves from other countries to America for sale. Many people did not like this act, but most agreed that it would be better for our nation in the future.
The Third Congress. Though many of them were owners of slaves, for the most part, they unanimously agreed that slavery was immoral. Of course, questions of economic problems and product manufacturing came into the picture, but the ultimate decision was to end the slave trade.
In the government document on prohibiting the importation of slaves, it states, quote, "And be it further enacted that if any ship or vessel shall be found from and after the 1st day of January, 1808, in any river, port, bay, or harbor, or on the high seas within the jurisdictional limits of the United States, or hovering on the coast thereof, having on board any Negro, mulatto, or person of color, for the purpose of selling them as slaves, or with the intent to land the same in any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States. Contrary to the prohibition of this act, every such ship or vessel, together with her tackle, apparel, and furniture, and the goods or effects which shall be found on board the same, shall be forfeited to the use of the United States, and may be seized, prosecuted, and condemned in any court of the United States."
This is John Brown's farm. This is where he spent the last few years of his life before the raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown did most of his planning for the raid right on this farm after he came from Bleeding, Kansas. John Brown knew that slavery was a disgusting institution of American society, and he wanted to change that for good. Timbuktu was John Brown's township where freed and escaped slave families could come live in the safety of his farm. Though it didn't work out in the end, it still was a very important part of John Brown's life, as it helped him to realize the terrors that were going on in the South.
John Brown wanted to fight against the South and try to turn Virginia into an anti-slave state. But he had a hard time recruiting men to join his militia, as it was considered unlawful. But eventually, he recruited 18 men to fight with him in battle. Brown paid Hugh Ford's $600 to be his drill master, which means to make his weapons for the raid.
This is the farm that John Brown rented for a few months before the raid on Harper's Ferry. This is where he trained his men and prepared them for battle. He chose this location because it was the most secluded so that people wouldn't hear him ordering his men and planning the raid.
Brown and his men raided an arsenal to get weapons and guns for his battle on top of the ones that Hugh Forbes made for him. Brown had his men recruit as many people as they could, and eventually got their group of 18 to a militia of 22.
A little before the raid, Brown stated, quote, "I've only a short time to live, only one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause. There will be no peace in this land until slavery is done for," end quote. After months of planning, training, and getting supplies, John Brown and his militia of men went to commence the raid on Harper's Ferry. This is Harper's Ferry, where John Brown started the raid.
John Brown took hostage of slave owners and pro-slavers and kept them hostage at Harper's Ferry for 2 days. John Brown's point of Harper's Ferry was to start a slave insurrection, based off the same ways Spartacus did in his slave rebellion 1,000 years earlier. He never had the intention of some sort of victory. In fact, he tried to surrender within the first day. But ultimately, he kept fighting for his cause with bravery, even though he knew the fact of his fate would be gruesome.
And Harper's Ferry was a very central location and a very strategic location. That's why the armory was there, and that's why he did the raid on Harper's Ferry.
John Brown once said, quote, "Had I so interfered in the behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right. Every man in this court would have been deemed an act of worthy reward rather than punishment." End quote.
A company of U.S. Marines arrived the next day. This company was led by Colonel Robert E. On the morning of October 19th, after 2 days of struggle, The U.S. soldiers finally overran Brown and his militia.
I don't think anything else other than succeeding in Harper's Ferry would have been as impactful.
After the Harper's Ferry raid, John Brown and a few of his men got hung and killed. But during it, he said the nation would pay in blood, and in the Civil War, they did.
Shortly after the Harper's Ferry raid, John Brown and a few of his men were sentenced to death and hanged on December 2nd, 1859. This is where he began to be pictured as a matron. Before his execution, John Brown had given a speech where he stated, quote, "If it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are discarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." End quote. With his speech and this line alone, he promoted people to fight for their rights and beliefs under the will of freedom. Only a few years after, in 1861 to 1865, the Civil War had begun. Without John Brown's actions, the Civil War and the North's victory may have never happened.
He was basically trying to let the nation know that the situation with slavery had to be addressed, and the only way that it was going to be addressed was by, unfortunately, blood, as he said in his speech.
Courage, bravery, and hope brought these men and the nation together under one unanimous passion to free the slaves. John Brown broke the barriers, showing the nation that they could come together, setting aside their differences, and fight for the better good.
The raid on Harper's Ferry brought to the nation, right in their face, the awareness of the evil of slavery, the effect it was having on people that were against it in the North and people that were for it in the South.
Though many events came after John Brown making the bold and courageous decision of doing Harper's Ferry raid, it is still one of the most inspiring stories of breaking barriers, allowing Black men, women, and freed Black families to fight for themselves and live a prosperous life. This story has made its works into today's society, with civil rights movements, with men like Martin Luther King fighting for equality and rights, and politicians of color making their own statements and still fighting for what they believe.
In our time period, there was civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King have both mentioned John Brown in their speeches as a unifying force of Black men and women and white men and women.
John Brown is an inspiration and will always be a part of America's story. But most importantly, John Brown's actions, breaking down the barrier for ending slavery, will never be forgotten.
John Brown's legacy will reign on. John Brown broke the standards, he broke the barriers, but he brought the nation together. This truly is the land of the free and the home of the brave.
When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then.